It was the kind of night that felt like every shadow was hiding something, every whisper a warning. The room was alive with murmurs, the clink of glasses, the shuffle of cards on the table. But when Bumpy Johnson stepped through the door, all of that ceased. The air itself seemed to go still, as though the entire world was holding its breath. At table 7, Jerome sat, nervously, his eyes darting around the room. He hadn't seen this coming, not really. 11 years he had been free. 11 years he had lived his life, thinking that time had erased the mistake, the betrayal, that would have ended him. He had disappeared from Harlem, changed his name, started over. He had gotten comfortable in the new skin he had created. But Bumpy Johnson didn't forget. Not ever. As Bumpy moved through the crowd, the room seemed to part for him, like the tide pulling away from the shore, leaving a path wide enough for the legend to walk. There was no rush in his step. He didn't need to rush. He was a man who commanded time itself to slow down in his presence. Jerome's heart began to pound in his chest. His throat went dry. The years of running, of hiding, had brought him to this moment. Bumpy's eyes met Jerome's. That was it. The world went silent. You thought you could hide, huh? Bumpy's voice cut through the tension in the room. It was calm, steady, yet every word was as sharp as a blade. You thought 11 years would make me forget? Jerome tried to swallow. He couldn't. His mind raced, searching for any escape, any defense, any way out of the corner Bumpy had backed him into. But there was nothing. Nothing except the weight of Bumpy's gaze, heavy with the kind of justice that only men like him could deliver. Bumpy didn't wait for an answer. He didn't need one. 11 years, and now you're back in my sights, Bumpy said, his voice like cold steel. The price is still the same, Jerome, and tonight you're gonna pay. Bumpy Johnson was more than just a name in Harlem. His was a legend born in the shadows, a figure who loomed large over the streets of New York. Born in Charleston in 1905, Bumpy moved to Harlem at a young age, drawn by the promise of opportunity and the unyielding pull of the streets. He was a man who understood the rules that others ignored at their peril. By the time the 1930s rolled around, Bumpy had become a pillar of Harlem's underworld. His reputation wasn't just built on brute strength or fear. It was built on his unshakable sense of loyalty and the ruthless justice he dispensed when that loyalty was betrayed. He wasn't just a gangster. He was the protector of Harlem's delicate balance. He was the man who ensured that the streets worked in his favor, and when someone disrupted that balance, Bumpy was the one who brought it back into order. Bumpy's empire stretched far beyond the street corners and back alleys. He had connections in every corner of Harlem. Businessmen, politicians, law enforcement, all of whom knew one thing. If you wanted to survive in Harlem, you needed Bumpy. He ran the numbers, controlled the rackets, and held the respect of everyone who mattered. Even the rival gangs knew better than to cross him. But it wasn't just his power that made him untouchable. It was the respect he commanded. Bumpy was a man who understood that loyalty wasn't something you could take for granted. It was something that had to be earned. And once earned, it was something that could never be broken. At least, not without consequence. Jerome, a man who had once been one of Bumpy's closest allies, had learned that the hard way. A trusted confidant, Jerome had worked beside Bumpy for years. They had built the empire together, and for a time, everything had been perfect. But somewhere along the way, Jerome had lost sight of the rules. Greed, ambition, and the lust for more had clouded his judgment. He thought he could cut a deal with a rival gang, sell out Bumpy for a quick payday, and walk away with more power than he could ever have imagined. But betrayal always has a cost, and in Harlem, the price for crossing Bumpy Johnson was steep. Jerome had made his move carefully. At first, it seemed harmless enough. Just a few whispers, a few secrets sold to the highest bidder. He thought he was playing the game. But Bumpy had seen through it all. He had seen the cracks before they even formed. The moment Jerome sold him out to the rival gang, the game was over. Bumpy didn't act immediately. He didn't need to. He had patience, a quality that had served him well throughout his rise to power. He let Jerome think he had gotten away with it. For 11 years, Bumpy waited. He watched. He let Jerome rebuild his life, grow comfortable in the new world he had created. For 11 years, Jerome thought Bumpy had forgotten. But Bumpy never forgets. And now, here they were, at table 7, a decade of running and hiding collapsing into this one inevitable moment. As Bumpy took his place before Jerome, the distance between them seemed to stretch impossibly far. The room, which had been filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses only moments before, now felt as silent as a tomb. Bumpy stood there, towering over Jerome, his presence overwhelming. There was no need for grand gestures, no need for words. The silence between them said everything. Jerome's body trembled, his mind searching for any excuse, any apology that might free him from this moment. But there was no escaping this. There never had been. The streets were about to speak, and Bumpy Johnson was the voice they had been waiting for. 11 years, Jerome, Bumpy said again, this time quieter, but the weight of his words was even more deadly. You thought time would make me forget, but you're still here, and you're still gonna pay. The air in the room thickened, the tension so palpable that every eye seemed to shrink away from the inevitable. Jerome felt the weight of Bumpy's stare, and for the first time in years, the world he had carefully built began to collapse around him. He had thought he had gotten away with it. He had thought time would heal the wound, would erase the betrayal. But time had only sharpened the blade, and tonight, Bumpy Johnson would use it. Bumpy didn't flinch as Jerome's eyes moved between the razor in his hand and the cold, calculating gaze Bumpy had fixed on him. There was no fear in Bumpy's eyes, only the certainty that justice would be delivered. I thought I could make it right. Bumpy, Jerome began, his voice trembling, but Bumpy cut him off with a flick of his hand. I don't want to hear it, Bumpy said, his tone hard as stone. You thought you could break the code, and there's no coming back from that. I gave you everything, and you turned your back on me. Jerome's mouth went dry. It was as if the words had drained from him, leaving nothing but the echo of his past sins. He had crossed a line, and now Bumpy was here to make sure it was erased. The betrayal wasn't just about money, it was about trust. And trust, once broken, couldn't be mended by words alone. The code of loyalty had been violated, and Bumpy's code was one that didn't bend. You were family, Jerome, Bumpy continued, his voice quieter now, but still thick with authority. You ate at my table. You got your hands dirty with me, and you thought you could just walk away? You thought you could betray me for some quick cash? That's not how it works. Jerome tried to stand, to move, to say something, anything that might save him. but his legs felt weak, his body frozen with fear. There was no running, no bargaining, no way out. Bumpy's words had crushed his spirit long ago, and now the cold reality of his fate settled in like a heavy stone in his gut. "I'm sorry, Bumpy," Jerome muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know what I was doing. I thought I could—" "Enough," Bumpy interrupted, his voice cutting through the room like a whip. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You betrayed me. And now you'll face the consequences." Bumpy's hand moved, slow and deliberate, as his fingers brushed against the razor. The steel gleamed in the dim light, a cold reminder of the justice Bumpy had served countless times before. This wasn't about emotion. It wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring balance. With a swift motion, Bumpy flicked the razor open. The sound of the blade was sharp, final, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any scream. "Don't," Jerome pleaded, panic creeping into his voice. "Please, Bumpy, I was desperate. It wasn't personal." Bumpy didn't respond to the words. He didn't need to. He had already made his decision. The blade flashed through the air, moving with deadly precision. It was a movement practiced 1,000 times over. With one clean stroke, the razor cut across Jerome's wrist, the blood immediately welling up and dripping onto the table. Jerome cried out in shock, the pain sudden and overwhelming, but even that couldn't drown out the reality of what had just happened. Jerome's hand flew to his wrist, but the blood wouldn't stop. He looked up at Bumpy, his eyes wide, the terror finally catching up to him. This wasn't just some street fight. This wasn't a slap or a threat. This was justice delivered without hesitation. Bumpy watched him, unmoved by the sight. The room remained still, the silence hanging heavy in the air. It was as though the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for the next moment to unfold. The men at the table, the ones who had witnessed the confrontation, didn't speak. They didn't need to. They knew the cost of betrayal in Bumpy's world, and they had just seen it with their own eyes. Jerome's body shook as he tried to stop the bleeding, but was no use. The damage had been done. There was no running from this, no escaping the price of his disloyalty. The street code had been violated, and Bumpy had restored order. Bumpy didn't look at the wound. His eyes remained locked on Jerome, his face a mask of impassive authority. "You should have known better," Bumpy said quietly. "When you cross a man like me, there's no going back." Jerome's body slumped in the chair, his hand still clutching his wrist. The pain was excruciating, but it was nothing compared to the emotional weight of what had just occurred. He had betrayed the wrong man, and now, in front of the people who mattered, he was paying the ultimate price. The men at the table had seen it all before. They had seen men cross Bumpy Johnson and fail to pay the price. But not like this. This wasn't some petty street scuffle or a random hit. This was justice, served as cold and precise as the razor that had cut Jerome's skin. Jerome's breathing grew shallow, his vision blurred by the blood loss and the shock. The reality of his situation was sinking in, and there was no escape. He had thought he could outrun Bumpy's wrath, but time hadn't protected him. The streets didn't forget, and Bumpy Johnson never did. Bumpy stepped back, his hand still gripping the razor, but he didn't look back at Jerome. His work was done. The room was still, the weight of the moment hanging over everyone. Bumpy's justice had been delivered. Without a word, Bumpy turned and walked toward the exit, his presence commanding the room. The silence that followed him out the door was deafening, as if the streets themselves were acknowledging what had just happened. Jerome was left behind, his betrayal sealed, his fate decided. His life, once so carefully crafted, had been unraveled in the span of a few minutes, and the streets of Harlem had witnessed it all. The men who remained in the room exchanged looks, but no one dared speak. No one had to. They had just seen a legend in action. They had seen Bumpy Johnson deliver justice in the way only he could. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't unnecessary. It was necessary to maintain the balance of the streets. And in that, Bumpy had solidified his place as not just a king of Harlem, but a man whose word was the final one in the world he had built. In the days that followed, the streets of Harlem had their own way of speaking. Word spread quickly about what had happened at Table 7. The whispers, the rumors, the hushed conversations, everything carried the same message. Bumpy Johnson had made it clear once again that his empire was unshakable, and betrayal had a price that could never be ignored. Jerome, once a trusted ally, had been a cautionary tale now. Men who had once called him a friend now turned their backs, avoiding his name as though speaking it might bring bad luck. The community had seen what happened when you crossed Bumpy Johnson. His empire was not just built on fear, it was built on respect. And the message Bumpy had sent made sure that respect remained intact. The men who still held power in Harlem, those who had once doubted Bumpy's reach or questioned his ability to handle disloyalty, now understood something unspoken. They had seen Bumpy act, not out of rage or blind vengeance, but with the cool, unflinching precision of a man who understood that justice had to be served. There was no hesitation in his movements, no second-guessing. Jerome had crossed the line, and Bumpy had corrected the imbalance with a simple, lethal finality. For the men who followed Bumpy, the respect was unquestioned. There was no longer any doubt that Bumpy was not just a kingpin. He was the enforcer of the streets. His actions didn't just maintain order, they defined the very laws that governed Harlem. His power wasn't something that could be negotiated. It could only be acknowledged and obeyed. Even the ones who had once believed they were immune, those who thought they could betray the trust of men like Bumpy, now understood the truth. There was no safe place for betrayal in Bumpy's world, and those who dared to test him would be reminded of that fact in the most permanent way. The wider world of Harlem took notice too. Bumpy was not just a street king. He was a symbol of something much larger. He was the embodiment of justice, of order, in a city that often felt like it was on the edge of chaos. His actions were a reminder to everyone in Harlem that there were rules, unwritten rules, and they would be enforced by Bumpy, who had built his empire on those very principles. As for Jerome, the world he had known was gone. The streets that had once been his domain had turned on him. His betrayal had erased him from the map. The power he had once held was stripped away, leaving him nothing but a man who had once been part of the most respected inner circle in Harlem, and now nothing more than a footnote in the story of Bumpy's justice. But for Bumpy, none of this was about personal pride. It wasn't about ego. It was about something deeper, something more ingrained in the fabric of the streets themselves. Bumpy's actions had not just preserved his own power. They had preserved the very thing that kept Harlem running. The idea that there was balance, that there was a system of checks and balances in place that made sure no one, not even the closest of allies, could escape the consequences of betrayal. Bumpy Johnson had, once again, solidified his legacy as a man who wasn't just a product of the streets, but the one who made sure the streets worked according to his laws. His justice was cold, but it was effective, and it ensured that the community he had helped build would never be threatened by the likes of men like Jerome. This story wasn't just about the betrayal of one man. It wasn't even about the razor that had delivered justice. It was about something far more significant, something far more universal. It was about the law that governed the streets, the code that everyone in Harlem knew but few truly understood. Bumpy Johnson's empire wasn't built on fear. It was built on respect, respect for the rules, respect for loyalty, and above all, respect for the community that had made him who he was. When that respect was broken, when betrayal reared its ugly head, Bumpy reminded everyone who was in charge. In a world where men lived and died by their alliances, where trust was more valuable than gold, Bumpy's word was law. The razor wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of justice, of retribution, of a system that would never allow betrayal to go unpunished. Jerome thought he could escape. He thought he could rewrite his history. But Bumpy had made sure the truth remained. The streets of Harlem would remember. They would remember who enforced the laws. They would remember who made sure the balance was maintained. This wasn't just about one man's fate. This was about the fate of the streets themselves. And sometimes it takes a legend to remind the world that loyalty and justice can never be taken for granted. The name Bumpy Johnson didn't just resonate in the streets of Harlem. It echoed across the years, a reminder of a man who held the power to shape history with a single decisive action. Bumpy Johnson was not just a figure in the underworld. He was the keeper of order, the protector of loyalty, and the enforcer of justice. His legacy was cemented not by the money he made or the empire he built, but by the justice he delivered when it mattered most. And in the end, it wasn't about who won the power struggle. It was about the lessons that would carry on long after the streets fell silent.